Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ISPE's quarterly webinar program. Today's presentation is Scenario Analyses for IURC Report to the 21st Century Energy Policy Task Force, presented by Doug Gotham. My name is Emily Stern, ISPE's Education Specialist. I will be your moderator for today. I'd like to go over a few things before we begin. All attendees have been muted to avoid audio feedback issues. All questions will be held until the end of the presentation. To ask a question, please type it in the questions box throughout the program, and I will read them aloud at the end as time permits. The slides for this presentation can be found in the handout section of the toolbar. You are eligible to earn a PDH by logging into this webinar for its duration, and you'll be receiving an email later today with your certificate. With that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Doug.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about a set of scenario analyses that we did for the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. They were assigned a task of producing a report to the 21st Century Energy Policy Task Force, and I'll explain a little bit about who we are and who they are here in a second. So in terms of the State Utility Forecasting Group, we are an independent policy and economic analysis group housed at Purdue University. We've been there since 1985, created by an act of the Indiana General Assembly in response to what at the time was over forecasting of electricity demand and overbuilding of new generators that had happened in the state. The university, so we're all university employees. The university has a contract with the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, which is the state regulators for the electric, natural gas, water, and wastewater utilities. We work proactively with the Indiana utilities, state government, various public interest groups, other stakeholders, from both the industrial side of things as well as the environmental side of things. We have a staff of, in addition to myself, we've got 5 full-time staff, and their backgrounds cover a range of areas from electrical engineering, which is my background, industrial engineering, economics, and public affairs. The 21st Century Energy Policy Task Force was formed by the state legislature in 2019. They were looking at what they considered to be a major potential issue going forward was the transition in fuel sources and technologies that we're seeing in the state's electricity system. Specifically, a large number of pending retirements of coal-fired generation, fairly rapid growth in wind and solar capacity starting to come online at the time and in the next few years. The members of the task force were comprised of legislators as well as various subject matter experts, which were appointed by the governor. The task force held a number of hearings, and they also tasked the Regulatory Commission with preparing a report on the effects of emerging technologies on reliability, resilience, and cost. As part of the Regulatory Commission's report, they worked with 3 different groups to produce sections of the report, including ourselves, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and Indiana University. So the rest of the presentation is basically just going to focus on the work that we did. So we were just part of that report, and this is going through the scenario analyses that we did for the commission's report. So they asked us to look at a number of different scenarios using our forecasting models. We've developed over time, going back to the 80s, a series of models that forecast future electricity use. We specifically focus on the long term. So our forecast is also used for identifying future resource needs, And one of the outputs of our forecasting model are prices, which is one of the focuses of this scenario analysis that we did here. In order to determine which scenarios were going to be included, the Regulatory Commission's conducted meetings with the utilities and stakeholders to see what their interests were. And the final scenarios and sensitivities were chosen by the Regulatory Commission themselves. There was input from stakeholders as well as from ourselves, but the ultimate determination came down to the Regulatory Commission. So these 7 scenarios that I'll talk about, those are the ones that the Commission, after talking to everybody, decided that they wanted to see. We did 7 scenarios. We also did 3 sensitivities where we included a price on carbon dioxide emissions. So the base scenarios have no CO2 costs, but the 3 sensitivities do. The purpose of this was not to try to model some specific future that may be plausible. So we weren't trying to get hung up on trying to get exact models of for instance, the carbon price for the price of CO2 for some proposed legislation that was out there. We wanted to make changes that were big enough to move the needle and see what the impacts of those changes would be. These 2 slides here are both basically show the same thing, and that is kind of the overall structure of our forecasting modeling system. And the important thing that comes out of our modeling system is that we were able to close the loop on the feedback between prices and demand for electricity. So if the price goes up, the demand for electricity will come down, and we can capture that in our modeling system through an iterative fashion here. Kind of the high level versions on the left, the one on the right shows a little bit more detail, the types of things that go into the forecasting models, and the types of things that go into the Aurora model. Aurora is a production costing and resource expansion model that's produced by Energy Exemplar, and we have a license for it. So we essentially start with an initial set of prices as well as all the demographic and price and economic inputs to the models, develop a forecast, run that through Aurora to see how much new resources are needed, what the cost of meeting that load is going to be. We then put that output into a utility finance model to determine rates and compare the rates, the initial rates to the rates coming out of that model. Have they converged, yes or no? If not, go back and do it again. And so we'll do that iteratively until essentially there's very small changes to no changes in price from one iteration to another. Start out with some of the limitations of the analyses. Pretty much any analysis like this, you're not going to be able to capture everything. A couple of important ones here, and it is that some of these scenarios and sensitivities resulted in a large portion of the energy coming from intermittent low inertia sources like wind and solar. There are definite operational challenges that come with high penetration of these types of resources, and our analysis did not try to address those operational challenges. And also, due to time and data limitations, we did not allow energy storage as a future resource option to be selected in that Aurora model. It's something that we're addressing going forward, but at the time, we just didn't have the time to devote to doing it properly, so we did not leave that as an option. And that may actually, if we had included energy storage, it's possible that some of that would have been chosen. So going through the scenarios, and there's a lot of material here, and I'll be going through it fairly quickly, but I'm happy to take questions at the end. first scenario was the reference scenario, which is essentially a business as usual. This was an updated version of the 20-year forecast that we had produced in the fall of 2019. So we almost went straight from producing that forecast to doing the scenario. This is scenario analysis, which came out in we finished it in the spring of 2020. The major difference between the business as our base forecast in 2019 and this reference case is we updated some of the information on unit retirements. The resource planning model, Aurora, in this case, selected a balanced mix of natural gas combustion turbine, natural gas combined cycle units, and wind capacity. For those of you who may not be familiar with the difference between natural gas combustion turbine and combined cycle, a combustion turbine is essentially takes natural gas as an input, which then turns the turbine, produces electricity. A combined cycle takes waste heat from that combustion turbine to make steam, turn a secondary turbine, and produce additional electricity. So natural gas combined cycle is much more efficient, but it's also more expensive to build. And the model takes that into account when it determines which is the most cost-effective to add. There's some solar capacity added in the last 2 years. From the graph on the right there, you can see the gray, the coal declining over time. That's driven by a combination of coal unit retirements as well as economic competition from natural gas and renewable resources. The brown is where the wind starts to show up. Essentially, I'll have several of these slides very similar for each one of the scenarios, so you can kind of compare how things change to the reference case. The reference case here, the reference scenario, is kind of our baseline that we'll use for comparison purposes. This slide shows essentially the same information, but we've taken pie charts for 5-year increments as we go along. So the one on the upper left is the energy output by source in 2020. So this is the where the energy is coming from, the state of Indiana, for producing all of the electricity needs. And that kind of shows you where we are today. Coal's the dominant source, 65%, followed by natural gas, nuclear, and a little bit of energy efficiency and solar. We do have some wind, but the way the wind is modeled, the current wind capacity that utilities have is all done through purchase power agreements. They don't own the wind. So it doesn't show up in the output of the model as wind. So there's none here, but it's actually fairly small. So I don't think that is a significant impact, and it doesn't really bias the results at all. And you can see over time how coal starts to decrease, natural gas increases, and then starting in 2025, in 2030 timeframe, we start seeing that wind start to show up. So the next scenario is a low renewables cost scenario. This was driven by stakeholder concerns that the cost of wind and solar that we had in our reference case, as well as in our 2019 forecast, were perhaps too high. And that was based on what was seen in public reports, either in the press releases from utilities who are building them, as well as in the integrated resource planning process that the utilities were going through themselves. And so the Regulatory Commission wanted to see what would happen if we used a lower set of renewables costs, just to see how sensitive the results were to renewable cost assumptions. So we went out and got capital costs from the National Renewable Energy Lab, which were lower than the costs coming from the Energy Information Administration. So essentially, both of these costs are coming from different parts of the Department of Energy. so to speak. There's just kind of different assumptions in terms of what those costs were. Also for this case, we used more aggressive reductions of what the costs in the future were going to be. The base case had some kind of more moderate cost reductions in the future, and these were more aggressive. So as we expected, lower capital cost renewables meant that the model built more wind and solar. Nothing shocking there. A big increase in solar, which is the green wedge here. You couldn't even really see the green wedge on the reference scenario. We went from the model building about 600 megawatts in the reference case to over 8 gigawatts in this particular scenario. It also adds it earlier. Wind capacity increased from 5.7 gigawatts to 9.5 gigawatts, and natural gas combined cycle were down from 6 to 3.7. One of the things you'll see throughout these scenarios is that wind and natural gas combined cycle tend to be substitutes for each other. And that's largely a function of the fact that they have higher capacity factors. That means we get more energy per megawatt of capacity from those than we would from a combustion turbine or from solar. So they tend to substitute for each other in these scenarios. Here are the pie charts again. The energy from wind and solar is much higher relative to the reference case. So about 30% of energy coming from wind and solar at the end of the analysis period versus about 13% in the reference case. One of the things we see is that the renewables are displacing natural gas. The coal's largely unchanged. There's very little difference in there. And the other thing is that of all the scenarios we did, this one provided the most balanced portfolio. So roughly equal amounts of coal, natural gas, and renewables out toward the end of the analysis period. So one of the things I mentioned, our model produces price projections. So this is a comparison of the reference case to that low renewables cost scenario. And as we expected, lower capital costs result in lower prices. So the orange there is the low renewables cost trajectory, and the blue is the reference. It's not a very large difference, 1% growing to 5%. So the cost differences are modest. You'll see that a little bit through most of these scenarios, and that's because a lot of the utilities costs are essentially sunk costs. That's that fixed investment that they've already made in the existing generation fleet, the transmission and distribution systems. So there's a large amount of fixed cost that goes into these prices. So changes that we make for these scenarios tend to have a big impact on prices unless they have a big impact on total load. I should note that the electricity prices here are a weighted average price across all customer classes for the 5 investor-owned utilities in the state. So those not-for-profit utilities, we model them, but we only model them at more of a wholesale level, the price that they charge their members. So we don't go down to the individual customer price for those utilities. There's just too many cooperatives and municipal utilities in the state for us to try to do it at a customer level. The amount of not-for-profit, the energy going to the not-for-profits is fairly small, so it doesn't really bias the results. So the next 2 scenarios are trying to look at the impact of some of those coal retirements. The 2025 moratorium scenario, in this case, we essentially said, what happens if we don't allow any of these units to retire at least through the end of 2025? And so in this case, any unit that was retiring in 2023 or so forth, we pushed back that retirement. We contacted the utilities to get information about what it would cost to keep those units online, because there would be costs associated with extending the lifetime of those units that's not included in our reference case. And there are, as those last two bullets show you, there are 3 units scheduled to be retired before 2025 that were not extended because of signed consent decrees where they have a legal obligation to shut it down, or in the case of Indiana, Michigan's Rockport unit, they don't own the unit, they lease the unit and wouldn't be renewing it. And so even if that unit were to continue, there wouldn't be any cost to customers, and the customers wouldn't be receiving any the electricity. So it would be immaterial to the analysis. So the delayed coal retirements, in this case, it kind of pushes out that the gray area when it starts to decline. So we're kind of flat through 2025. Then we start to see that decline that we saw before. There's really little long-term influence. The endpoint is pretty similar to what we had in the reference case. We're getting a balanced mix of natural gas combustion turbines, we call CTs, combined cycles, and wind capacity, just as we did in the reference case, being the stuff that was added by the Aurora model. So it really kind of just delayed the inevitable, so to speak, when it came to the coal retirements, but didn't have a long-term impact. So the one thing that is different here, significantly different, is the 2025 pie chart, which is quite different energy mix, much higher in terms of coal, much higher in terms of natural gas. And it also postponed wind when the model chose wind. And so we weren't adding wind as soon. And at that point, we hadn't added any, but eventually we do in roughly the same amount as before. So the price impact here, the electricity prices are generally slightly higher, but only 1% or 2% than in the reference case. So what this is telling us is that the cost associated with extending the life of those units pretty much offsets the cost of replacing them if we don't extend it. And so price-wise, there's very little impact, perhaps just a little higher. Similar scenario, but in this case, we extend that moratorium out to 2030. So there's a few more units that were scheduled for retirement between 2025 and 2030 that this captures. In addition to those 3 units that were not extended in the 2025 moratorium case, we've got 1 more unit due to a consent decree that is not extended. Results here, as in the previous scenario, new resources are not needed until 2026. I should have mentioned in the reference case they were needed in 2024. So that moratorium does push out when we need new resources by a couple of years. In this case, it adds some resources in 2026. We don't need a lot until 2031 when we start to see those delayed retirements. And then also in this case, the model chooses less wind than it did in the reference case. The model tends to like wind in the late 2020 time period, less so than it does out into the 2030s. And so we have less wind, but we have more combined cycles. So again, we're seeing some of that substitution between wind and combined cycle that the model does between scenarios. So the energy from coal stays strong through 2030 and then drops. So you'll see that the 2025 pie chart is pretty similar to what we saw in the 2025 moratorium. The 2030 pie chart is not like the previous ones, but we still eventually get back to that switch from coal to natural gas. And because the models added more natural gas in this case than the others, the amount of natural gas out at the end is 55% is higher than it was in the reference case or the 2025 moratorium. In terms of prices, we see a little bit of a price increase in the early term period from about, say, 2021 through 2026 or so. But it's out at the end, it's virtually unchanged. So it's less than a 1% difference in either direction in any given year. And that's the reasoning behind this is very similar to what we saw in the 2025 moratorium, that the increased cost for extending the life is roughly equivalent to the cost incurred if you do retire them and have to replace them with other capacity. So another scenario that we did was the additional energy efficiency scenario. So this looked at what would happen if we had more aggressive utility-sponsored energy efficiency programs. So there are some energy efficiency programs in the reference case. The idea here was, let's see what happens if we double that amount. A caveat here, that first bullet, is that we lacked information on the potential for and cost of higher levels of energy efficiency. So we used a simplified approach. This is consistent with the idea we're trying to move the needle here rather than model some specific future thing that may happen in the future. When we doubled the amount of energy efficiency, we ran into a problem with one utility, NIPSCO, up in the northern and northwestern part of the state. We're using information for the reference case based on their most recent integrated resource plan, which had a higher level of energy efficiency than the other utilities. And what happened when we doubled it, we got to the point where it was essentially displacing all of the load. Or close to it. And if there's almost no load, but you've got all these fixed costs, prices go through the roof. And that was causing some significant modeling issues. So after discussing this with the Regulatory Commission, they instructed us to leave NIPSCO's where it was in the reference case and just double everybody else's. In terms of cost, like I said, we did not have a reasonable cost of numbers for more aggressive energy efficiency. And in reality, in the integrated resource plans, the utilities are generally going to pick the lowest hanging fruit. They're going to take the most cost-effective energy efficiency programs and include them in there. So increasing that's going to be higher cost programs. But we didn't really increase the cost. We just doubled the overall cost, which meant that the higher energy efficiency savings were occurring at the same cost as the original. We know that understates the cost, but picking some arbitrary number would put us in a position where we don't know if it understates or overstates, and would actually, while we have uncertainty here, we at least know the direction of it. So the results from the more aggressive energy efficiency programs, so you see the red wedge up at top is larger, that's the increased energy efficiency. In this case, the model built less wind and combustion turbines, combined cycle were slightly higher, and more solar photovoltaics. So it changed the mix a little bit. And part of it is that energy efficiency tends to affect the overall load shape. So it may have more impact on peak demand than off-peak demand and so forth, which has a tendency in the model to shift what is the most economic options going forward. So as expected, energy efficiency represented a larger share of energy. A little over 6% instead of around 4% in the later years. And wind was lower, the model built less wind. The other sources here were largely unchanged. Not a whole lot there. This should be too shocking. The price projections, in this case, prices are a little bit higher, especially in the early years through 2024. And this is because we're incurring costs associated with this energy efficiency, higher energy efficiency, but we don't need capacity at the time. So there's no avoided cost of new generation during that time period and to offset the cost of those energy efficiency programs. In the longer term, the prices are very similar, less than 1% higher. But keep in mind, as I mentioned, we know that we understated the program costs, so the actual price impacts may be slightly larger. And the other thing I should point out is even though prices are higher, that doesn't mean higher bills to the individual customers because the usage is reduced by those energy efficiency programs. And the bill is essentially the product of the price and the usage. So next scenario, industrial self-generation. There was interest from stakeholders in looking at the impact of significant amounts of industrial self-generation, cogeneration, or combined heat and power. So in this case, the large manufacturing companies out there would generate some of their own power as opposed to buying it from the utilities. Some of it may be in combination with steam use that they have for their own processes and so forth. The amount of future industrial self and cogeneration is highly uncertain, and we didn't have the capability to produce a credible forecast of these, so we used a proxy. And again, this is consistent with the idea we're not really trying to model the specific future. We want to make this a significant change, move the needle, and see what happens. In this case, as our proxy, we assumed that all future growth in industrial electricity use was going to be offset by industrial self-generation. So we held industrial electricity consumption for the investor-owned utilities to be flat. We didn't change the not-for-profit utilities, the municipal utilities and the cooperatives, because we don't model those at the customer class level. We don't have a residential model for them, a commercial model, and an industrial model. But again, it's fairly small, especially in the industrial sector, since many of those don't have much in terms of industrial load. So in terms of results, the overall future resources that were needed, that were added by the model, were lower, but that's driven by the fact there's lower load. So because we're not growing on the industrial sector. The wind capacity was actually somewhat higher than the reference scenario. And as I mentioned, when wind goes one direction, the combined cycles tend to go the other, so it was lower. The photovoltaics and combustion turbines were slightly lower, so it made a little bit of an impact, not a huge, but a little impact there. The shares by source were largely unaffected. Since it built more wind and a little bit less natural gas, there's a little bit of movement in that direction, so wind increased somewhat. Natural gas was down slightly. So there's not a big impact here in terms of the energy mix and what the model is producing for future resources. The biggest impact here was actually on prices. So in this case, the prices actually increased, which may seem a little counterintuitive. If load goes down, why does price go up? And that's actually a function of the way regulated utility prices get set. There's a return on fixed return on investment. So there's a lot of sunk costs. There's that return is in there. If sales go down, the utilities still have to recover all of that fixed investment. So they charge more. They end up charging more in order to recover that fixed investment. So in this case, what's happening is the reduction in sales is greater than the reduction in revenue requirements. You could look at it just as basically the rates is a fraction. The numerator is the dollars that the utility needs to recover from their bills in order to meet their expenses, including that fixed return on past investment. And the denominator is the energy that they're providing. So in this case, the denominator is going down faster than the numerator. Next scenario is a high natural gas price scenario. And this one was actually something that the task force member, one or two of the task force members had asked about, is what might happen if we had very high natural gas prices that might occur if there was a ban on fracking for natural gas. With the price of natural gas under a fracking ban being purely speculative, we stuck with that overall theme of let's move something to the point where it moves the needle, but not try to figure out what the price of natural gas without fracking would be. And so that's what we use. We use a $10 per million BTU annual price for natural gas. To give you a point of reference for those of you who may not be familiar, generally for the last, maybe 12 years or so, the price of natural gas has been in the $2 range, sometimes getting as high as $3 per million BTU range, occasionally under 2. And so this is roughly a tripling, fourfold, fivefold increase in natural gas prices. So out of all the scenarios we ran, this one had the biggest impact on resource selection. The model chose a very large amount of wind, including adding some immediately, even though we don't need any resources in the short term in order to meet load with a reserve margin buffer included. So it's doing that purely based on economics. Photovoltaics roughly doubled. The natural gas combined cycle units nearly dropped out completely, went from 6 gigawatts to less than 1 gigawatt. And combustion turbines actually increased, even though they're natural gas fired. And while we put new coal units or nuclear units in the model as an option, they were not selected, even with that very high price of natural gas. So the pie charts here are quite interesting. Wind became the dominant source of energy, almost half of it by 2035. So we're getting 48% of our energy from wind, another 1% from solar, so about half of it from renewables out here. And as I mentioned, we didn't really try to capture what the operational impact of something like that might be. The energy from natural gas dropped to a third of what it was in the reference scenario. And interestingly enough, the share of energy from coal actually went down, even though natural gas prices went up. And this was because the model was using coal more as to make up for the intermittency of the wind that was in place. So it was using coal as a cycling or peaking capacity, just to use it when the wind stopped blowing, essentially. And so it was actually using it less than it was. This scenario also saw the largest price impact. So prices in the early years, 1 to 2% higher, then increased to over 20% higher late in the analysis period. This is compared to the reference case, and as you remember, in the reference case, we had a fairly significant amount of natural gas being used out in those later years. So it's having to find something else that may be more expensive than in the reference case to avoid paying that very high fuel cost for all that natural gas. This slide gives you kind of a comparison to the resource additions across all of those scenarios. You can see that substitution effect if you look across between combined cycle and wind, fairly consistently happening. In the 2030 moratorium, we have combined cycle going up, wind going down. The reverse is happening in the low renewables cost and the high gas price scenario, for instance. And finally, I'm going to talk about the carbon price sensitivities we did. We did a carbon price on 3 of the scenarios. And the price that we use for carbon here was developed collaboratively by us and the Regulatory Commission. Again, looking to try to see what the broader impacts were. So in order to get try to get the most information from it, we decided to do a low price and then have it grow to higher levels so we could see what the impact of a low price was and see what the impact of a high price was by looking at the different time periods. The 3 scenarios that were selected, and again, these were chosen by the Commission, were the reference scenario, the 2030 moratorium scenario, and the low renewables cost scenario. And so one of the things we saw here was even with carbon price scenarios, while it tended to add more wind and solar, that didn't necessarily become the dominant source of energy. In the reference scenario, in the 2030 moratorium scenario, there's roughly 40% natural gas and 33% wind. The low renewables cost scenario became very high amounts of wind, even more so than what we saw in that high natural gas price scenario beforehand, where almost 60% of energy was coming from wind. Coal in all 3 scenarios dropped significantly, about 9%, 6% to 9%, depending on which one of the sensitivities we're looking at. Electricity prices in all cases were higher, slightly higher in 2025 when that low price starts, and growing to anywhere from 14 to 27% higher out toward the end. In all of those comparisons, electricity prices are to their equivalent scenario with no carbon. So the 2030 moratorium price is a comparison of with and without carbon, so forth, to the other scenarios. So in terms of resources that the model's choosing, you can see in all 3 of these that the model is choosing significantly larger amounts of wind. One interesting thing, at least for me here, is we no longer see that substitution effect between combined cycle and wind. We don't really see significant increase or decreases of combined cycle when we add, some cases 10 gigawatts or even more so in the low renewables cost, more wind. We actually see a substitution effect between the combustion turbines and the wind. And what's driving this is the model is essentially building the higher cost combined cycles, but operating them more like it was previously the combustion turbines. It's willing to pay more for that high efficiency to avoid emitting carbon. The energy supply, you can see the first 2, the reference and the 2030 moratorium, have very similar trajectories, while that low renewables cost, a combination of a low renewable cost and a cost on carbon emissions, the model loves wind. In terms of prices, all the trajectories are fairly similar, where you've got increasing prices and that the difference between the with and without CO2 all grow over time. And I'll end up with some overall observations that we included, we provided for the Commission for their inclusion in their report to the task force. In terms of resource selection, in all scenarios and sensitivities, the model had some combination of natural gas-fired generation, combustion turbines and combined cycle units, some wind and some solar, largely in a predictable fashion. And despite the fact that we gave the model coal and nuclear as an option to be chosen, it was never chosen in any of those cases. The renewable resources, the results were highly sensitive to the price assumptions for the renewable resources. You can see that in that low renewable cost scenario. In terms of energy from coal, which is the largest source currently, it decreases over time in every scenario. That's driven by a combination of retirements of existing generation and economic competition with natural gas and renewables. Imposing a retirement moratorium provides a temporary boost while that moratorium is in place, but eventually it drops to roughly the same level that we have currently, at least in all the non-carbon price scenarios. The imposition of a carbon price results in the largest additional decreases in coal utilization, with coal being about 6 to 9% of total in 2035 for the carbon price sensitivity. In terms of the effective carbon prices, the lower carbon prices in the early years tend to cause a shift from coal to natural gas. So when we have a low price in those early years, the model's using less coal but more natural gas. As that carbon price increases later on, it shows renewable displacing both coal and natural gas. So coal continues to go down, renewables go up, and the natural gas is also being displaced. So I think that's everything I've got. My contact information is here, as well as our website. We make all of our reports available for free download on our website. So there's a number of other things in there, looking at renewable energy, effect of environmental regulations, so forth, as well as our forecasts. I'd be happy to take questions.
Okay, thanks, Doug. We're going to go into our Q&A section of the presentation. It looks like we have a couple questions. The first one, can you discuss more why the renewables replace natural gas rather than coal? What happens if there are penalties for coal emissions?
So the part of it is the overall substitution that we see between, say, for wind and combined cycle, is that the coal is already in place. So those are sunk costs. So the substitution we're seeing is for future resource additions. So the model needs to add something in order to be able to meet the load. And the coal itself, since the model never chooses coal, it's looking at the existing coal. So it's just really fuel and variable O&M costs that determine how much of that gets used. Whereas for future resource additions, the capital costs of those also come into play. And as we see in the carbon sensitivities, if there's a penalty that affects fossil fuel generation, in this case it affects coal more significantly than it does natural gas, we really see that the model saying, I don't really like coal so much. And it uses a lot less coal in those cases.
Okay, we have another. Did the models incorporate transmission grid revisions or expansions?
It does not. So the Aurora model that we use for the production costing and the resource expansion does have a transmission component. We use a very simplified version of that, and we keep that static through the throughout the analysis period. There is an estimate in the capital cost of new units of the cost of connecting to the transmission system that tends to affect things like wind, which may not be produced in areas that already have transmission interconnections, more so than it does some of the other resource options, but that's a fairly small component. We just don't have the information and the expertise to really do justice to transmission modeling. And there are folks out there like the regional transmission organizations that do that for a living that are much better at it and much more suited for doing it.
What factors such as EV percentage did you use to estimate future electricity demand?
So our model, our forecasting model, at least at that point, did not specifically capture electric vehicles. There is, so for our models for the residential sector are what's called end use models. So they build up from individual end uses like lighting, space heating, air conditioning, water heating, so forth. And there is a miscellaneous category, which tends to capture a little bit of stuff like that, but it's not specifically capturing EVs. The miscellaneous category tends to grow over time, but we can't pull out what is EV. I've looked separately into what EV, the impacts of EV might be, and large amounts of EV would be noticeable on the system, but not an issue that would be extremely difficult to work with. Now, the folks at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab that did their part of the study, that's one of the things they were specifically looking at. And it's also something we're looking at for our future analyses and our future forecasts, is incorporating electric vehicles. The other thing that Lawrence Berkeley looked at that we didn't have in there was distributed resources, like solar panels mounted on houses. We didn't have that in our model, but they did in theirs.
Okay, the next question, how can coal-fired plants be used as peaking units? Doesn't the startup cost severely limit that?
It does. And so, yeah, and there's also minimum run times. There's sometimes issues with ramp rates, so they can't change output very quickly. And all of that stuff's actually built into the model. And so the model decided that in some cases like that, like the high natural gas case, that it would rather incur those startup costs and stuff than it would to build a natural gas fired unit and pay $10 a million BTU for natural gas. Now, one of the things that would result in that we can't really capture is some of the increased wear and tear on the coal-fired units from doing that. And so it's not, we may, you know, it may adversely affect the life of the unit.
Okay, both coal and natural gas are produced in Indiana and contribute to our economy. Has there been any study taking into account the loss to the economy due to their lesser role?
So that's basically what the IU portion of the IURC study was, looking specifically at the economic and job impact of retiring coal-fired units. There have been, in terms of coal mining, there have been studies that are fairly dated now. Purdue had used to have a Center for Coal Technology Research a few years ago, and they had commissioned a study looking, and I want to say this was maybe 15 years ago, looking at the impacts of coal mining on the state economy. The number of coal mining jobs are actually fairly low, but there's a fairly significant economic effect in terms of how it spills over into other parts of the economy, especially local in the coal mining areas. But beyond that, I'm not aware of anybody who's looked at that any more recently than that.
Okay, are small modular reactors included as options in the nuclear portfolio, or are they just the more traditional large nuclear units?
So in our model, we're not modeling specifically SMRs, but we do allow our model to essentially build partial units. So we're not forcing the model to choose a 1,000 megawatt nuclear unit. It can build a 50 megawatt portion of a 1,000 megawatt nuclear unit. That's a little different than a small modular reactor, but in terms of the things that the model is going to choose, it's not that much different. And there's still a lot of uncertainty, I think, in terms of cost for small modular reactors, since we haven't really seen any commercial construction at this point.
Okay, this is going to be our last question. What is the end game purpose of this modeling?
That's a question for the task force, I think. So the task force actually produced a report. Essentially what we were looking for, I think what the commission was looking for from us, which I hopefully is what we delivered, was to give an idea of how various factors would affect the future mix of resources that were used, how they would affect prices, and to see how sensitive our overall utility system was to some of these various factors like carbon prices, natural gas prices, prices of renewable energy, energy efficiency, so forth.
Okay, that was our last question. If anyone has any more questions, Doug's contact info is on your screen. Thank you everyone for attending our quarterly webinar program. Like I said, you'll be receiving your PDH certificate via email later today. Thanks again, Doug, for your time, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.